Welcome to Milling About the Butternut, a presentation on historic mills in the Butternut Valley. This is a joint effort by the Butternut Valley Alliance and the Morris Historical Society. This is truly a sharing of resources between these two organizations because it incorporates the historical photographs and documents collected by the Historical Society and the survey of the Butternut and its tributaries led by the BVA. At the end of the presentation, you may add your name and contact information to the sign-in sheets for either the Historical Society or the BVA, found on these tables right over here. The survey of the Butternut and its tributaries was conducted by the BVA from 2016 to 2018. Its purpose was to record the erosion found along these waterways so that steps could be taken to mitigate it. Tom Washman and several others in this room tonight walked a total of 137 miles, taking pictures, taking measurements, and writing descriptions of eroded sites. As Tom walked the Butternut, Calhoun, Dunderberg, Thorpe, Cope, and Oregon, he saw the foundations of many mills that had once drawn their power from these creeks. Tom, whose family has owned property in Morris since 1831, was very interested in the history of these mills, which were now just archaeological sites. Although he was raised and then worked in the South, retiring from the Norfolk Southern Railroad as an industrial development manager, he had been coming north for over 65 years to visit his family home in Morris. In 2015, he became year-round summer folk and immersed himself in the history and nature of the Butternut Valley. So let's join Tom as he mills about the Butternut Valley, sharing with us pictures and information about these structures, which were once found everywhere along our creeks. And Tom asks that we hold our questions until the end. Tom?
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our aim tonight is to present a brief history of milling in the Butternut Valley from the close of the 1700s to the early 1900s. Also, what is referred to as the Industrial Revolution, and its relationship to the growth and development of the valley communities in which we live today. My connection to milling? Well, let's step back to colonial times. Central New York was just opening up to settlement. Hardy pioneers were moving into the wilderness before the conflict of the Revolution. They were easy targets for harassment by the Native Americans in the uproar, most forced to retreat to the safety of the Hudson Valley or to abandon their ventures altogether. After the coming peace, a number of savvy young men looking to make their fortune began picking up the titles to abandoned claims for very low cost and promoting them for the development of the new nation. Some of the original settlers returned to start over. Ziba Washburn and his wife Nancy Northrup packed up their family in Newtown, Connecticut and moved to the wilderness of Otsego County to settle in Maple Grove. They brought 3 young sons and their servants in the company of 19 families from Newtown. At the same time, about 80 souls moved from New Milford, Connecticut, settling in the New Lisbon area. The Washburns had lived in Newtown vicinity for over 4 generations. Joshua Matson, moved his family from Powell, Vermont, sometime in the 1800s, bringing 3 sons and a daughter to farm in Lawrence. The Matson family had previously resided in West Kent, Rhode Island for nearly 100 years. No one came alone. Most moved from a community where they or their spouse was related to many others and created communities where they were similarly related. They left communities that had established ports, roads, posts, churches, schools, stores, mills, artisans and mechanics to come to a truly undeveloped wilderness. Zeba and Nancy added more than 7 children, added 7 more children to their family farm on the top of Violet Hill. Zena's, whose house still stands at the corner of Route 8 and 10 in Maple Grove, became the postmaster there and operated the sawmill downstream by Taylor Road. 1813, Andrew Washburn married Polly Crettenton, the daughter of a large Morris landowner, Jeremiah, and began raising a family. He had capital to begin investments in real estate enterprises. He falls in with a fast crowd. Judge Francho, VP Van Rensselaer, Benja Davis, Yuri Jackson, Captain Dan Smith, John Cox Morris, and Joseph Gilbert, among others. He appears as agent and treasurer for the Butternut Wool and Cotton Mills in 1819. Another advertisement suggests the partnership began with Luther Skidmore in the winter of 1822 for Flax Oil Mill located north of Louisville in the southeastern corner of Lot 64 on the highway leading from Louisville to New Berlin. The oil pond appears to have been in the course of Silver Creek at the town line where the village reservoir is now located. Skidmore and Washburn may have been leasing the property until they purchased the mill from Van Rensselaer in 1825. They sell it off to Horatio Seeley and Jared Todd in December of 1841. Joshua D. Matson dabbled in various pursuits, farming, tavern keeping, promoting stage lines before moving to Lawrence, from Lawrence to Mars. His son Benjamin H. and his brother-in-law Augustus Steer, also of Rhode Island, purchased 25 acres on the west end of the village and established a tannery on the bank of Calhoun Creek, and had the house at 40 West Street constructed sometime later that decade. The tannery business, the farmstead and house were purchased in 1850 by O.B. Matson, his brother, financed by his father-in-law and his father. Otis, Joshua, and Bates ran the tannery. It appears to have been in operation until Otis's death in 1891. O.B. also had an interest in the tannery in Holmesville below South New Berlin, and he purchased in 1860 a tannery in New Berlin, established in 1801, which in turn he sold in 1870, and turned his attention back to the Morris Tannery, which operated another 20 years. After his death, his wife sold it off the building in 1893, which was purchased by Nichols and Phillips and moved to Mill Street to replace the sawmill and grits mill, which had burned down the year previous. The stone foundations from the tannery were used in the construction of the new Union School in 1894 and had been salvaged from the old mill building. Andrew G. and Joshua D. Matson were my great-great-great-grandfathers. They were neighbors. A.G. building the stone house on the corner of 23 and 51, and their farms abutted. I'm sure they were trading partners, given the leather was essential to the textile mill operations A.G. managed. Eventually, 2 of the Matson daughters married Washburn cousins, and both families exited the milling business by the 1900s. I began visiting my mother Mary, my great aunt Ann, and cousin Henry at Morris in the 1950s as a small child. My father inherited the Matson house on West Street, and I have came to retire there, as I have as well. I grew up listening to tales of old A.G. and the woolen mill making uniforms for the Union Army, of lumber deals gone bad, of the Matson child lost when he fell into a tanning vat in a house being built because his wife could not live above the tannery anymore. I was lucky enough to hear living memories from the children of the late 1800s who have passed beyond. We found a few relics and remnants of the life of the frontier and the development of the industry in the valley. Playing amidst the ruins of the bowl mills upstream, climbing on the ruins of the Mill Pond Dam, running in the head race and thinking of the power of water, the image of the water wheel and the working mills has held a fascination for my entire life. Starting in 2017, we were assisting with the Butternut Valley Creek watershed assessment. I had the opportunity to walk many of the tributaries and observe firsthand the remnants of more hydraulic work scattered about us, renewing my fascination and sparking a desire to learn more about the shared industrial heritage. When William Cooper came in 1786 to settle the Otsego tract, picking it up for cents on the dollar from the private owner, only Croghan's hut, a few apple trees, and some decaying log fences remained. Cooper had an unusual philosophy at this time. Most big development encouraged people to come and rent the land and pay an annual rent, but they had no real interest in the land. The land was held by an absentee landlord. Cooper said, this doesn't encourage people to invest and develop. And you'll note one of the principal things, often the mill seats and the prime property was withheld from the development by the owners because they figured they would make more money from it in the end. Cooper didn't believe in this. He sold everything, anything and everything. This is from Cooper's original deed book. This is Aldrich Creek and the mills at Burlingame Falls, which Louis de Villers, a millwright and landowner from New Lisbon, built. That was one of the first mills. Jacob Morris came in 1787 to his land on where the Morris Manor is located. And the first thing he sets to do, looking around, he says, I don't want to live in a log cabin. I want to live in a real house. I'm going to build a sawmill and I'm going to build a frame house. And next year I'm going to build a bigger house and add to it. Again, this was one of the first mills in the valley constructed. If you're going to build a community, what do you need? Well, somebody has to house, feed, and clothe these people if they're going to thrive. These were the basic technology available in 1800 to do this. Water power was the only alternative source of mechanical energy other than man, home, horse, or ox. Sawmills, make all kinds of products that we need, and they expand simply beyond sawing planks and lumber into many, many useful products. Cider presses, apples, the best way to preserve the apple crop was to press it and turn it into apple cider. There was no lubricating oil available. And flaxseed was pressed both for vegetable cooking oil, and it was also the basis for paints, the oil, linseed oil. Hardware had come from someplace. Interestingly enough, Morris had its own iron deposit and developed forges. And tanning was the plastic, leather was the plastic of the day. There was nothing to substitute for plastic. If you needed a flexible connection and a long lasting connection, it was made out of leather. Mills were the technology that made all this possible. Grist milling was the seasonal business connected to the harvest, as was the cider press. Once you had the structure, the dam, the pond, and the gate, adding a flume to take out water off of it to power a forge or a sawmill was easy and helped defray the cost of construction and maintenance, and could spread out your labor. So we find clusters of businesses around which the communities grew. Often in deeds and covenants, we find the contract with the other mill owners as to how much water they can draw off and their responsibility for maintaining the system. In the beginning, at the head of the valley, settlers traveled in, and the first thing they did was they set up a mill. Here, Avery Park travels to Burlington from Connecticut and builds a tannery, which he later moves into town and then builds a grist mill later. In the area called Hoboken, which later developed in the Albright mills, you can still see the Hoboken Dam and the remnants of the pond as you drive up Route 80 from New Berlin to Edmonds, that you cross right over the area of the Hoboken, what was called the Hoboken Dam. And curiously enough, we have a sawmill there, again, not water powered, unfortunately. Our friend Louis de Villers builds the first mill complex at what's known as Myers Mills outside of Stetsonville. Which stays in business until 1937, before it finally burns down. And the dam is washed away in 1948. Much of the early activity took place in Elm Grove. Some was successful and some wasn't. Where the Morris Reservoir is today, Van Rensselaer built an oil mill for pressing seeds sometime between 1810 and 1811. Davis builds a tannery on the opposite side of the brook from where we are today. which we just find amazing. Tanneries smell awful. Can you imagine? And they just wash their waste into the stream. But he was very successful, and the mill lasted for 20 or 30 years, right down here behind Naylor's. The old grist mill became the first mill on Mill Street and Lake Street off the Hargrave Lake in 1805. Which someone has preserved in a beautiful, beautiful painting.
So does that sit where the foundry roughly is now? Or?
It's actually closer, almost at the fairground gate.
Okay.
The bog iron ore furnace was built by a franchise company and would have used water power for the bellows, the hammer, and was using the same dam site as the Bailey Mills from Bailey Mill Pond. This story, I think, is apocryphal because franchise supposedly built it in 1811, and the dog would have been aging backwards to have run out and scared Miss Cooper in 1800. But it's a nice story. But supposedly the Iron Around Monument came from the forge that was located across the road. Let's see the forge. Right there. Here's the man. Here's Jacob Morris's first sawmill. Gilbert came immediately after Morris. Morris actually chose the long acreage. Gilbert chose the better acreage. But they lived with it. Other people arrived with him. Obviously, a sawmill, grist mill were the first things they built. A tavern, an apple orchard, a tannery was like the Devil and Coy Brook, and Gilbertsville was now considered an established community. The area around Lover's Lane was where the foundry, the sawmill, Bennett's wool mill, and the grist mill were all established. It's very, as near as I can tell, the pond would have been up in this area above the creek. It's very hard to see what was left, and there's no remnants that I've been able to see of anything in that area. Just a few statistics. From the Gazetteer of 1810, I believe, there's a profile of every town in New York. And so these are the things that Stratford considered important in the survey of the town. And we have a little census of what had been developed between 1786 and 1810. We have a little census of our communities growing and the thing and what had been established in each town. In red are the current population, well, the 2010 census numbers for the different towns, this being Butternut and Morris together. And this is what they're supporting almost 10,000 people with. is this infrastructure. Also, so after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we shift gears into a different, we're moving out of the survival situation between 1810 and 1820. We're moving out of survival situation. This quote is again from Stratford's 1810 about the township of Butternuts, where we wear our homespun as a badge, a yeoman's badge of honorable distinction. I love that phrase. In all the descriptions of all the 6 towns, they refer to the inhabitants all doing home weaving and all wearing homespun. Behind that is the Butternuts woolen and cotton mills down on East Side Road.
Oh, it's such a beautiful building.
It's a shame, yeah.
Yeah. Looks so solid.
It was actually damaged in an earthquake in 1870. It didn't fall down. So what's happened? The next generation, those 10 kids that Ziva and Nancy had, all couldn't stay on the farm. Ziva lived till 1842, so obviously they had to go out and go somewhere and do something. The Lulls, Jacob Kay, is a good example of this. Born in 1794, he was the 10th child of 16. He left home at 17 to learn the tanner's trade in Hudson, New York. Circumstances changed during his apprenticeship. He returned to work for a Willard Cagney of Butternuts for 3 years. Now an established journeyman, he rented a small tannery and commenced business for himself. 1 year later, he built his own tannery in Elm Grove, where he carried on the business for 21 years. And then he got sick of tanning. Not surprising. After 27 years in the business, he gave it up to make boots and shoes. He built a copy shop, which is now the Morris Library. His cousins Nathan and Oliver came from an equally big Lull family, who were some of the original settlers, and they entered into the wool trade as carters and wool millers. Nathan's was built on the site of the old forge, and Oliver was on Pete Road. Oliver's shop was on the Butternuts down on Pete Road. And Nathan apparently lived in the stone house where the Strohs live now. The syndicate that AG had fallen in with, Francho, Winslear, Cox, Morris, and et cetera, bought up the existing cotton mills or mills, bought up the mill down on East Side Road and formed a company. They built the started building the Butternuts mill in 1825. They built the hard grade mill between 1832 and between 1830 and 1832. And then they went over to Pittsfield and invested in the Arkwright mill, and they built 2 mills in Pittsfield in the 1830s. Now, the Phoenix Mill, south of Cooperstown, Hope Mill, south of Cooperstown, and the Union Factory were all considered enormous mills. And they employed about 40 people each. But look at the amount of spindles that are here just in these 3 mills, the amount of spindles that are being turned out here in Morris. It's really amazing to think of Morris leading this technological revolution. On the other end of town, Joshua D's oldest son, B.H., has had one son die in tannery, another son die in childbirth. The tannery burned down in 1847. And so by 1849, I think he had it, and he was tired of tanning as well. He goes off to move up to Warren Hill and farm and build other houses and becomes the census marshal, does lots of other things for a long time, but he sells the mill to his brother. He's writing back to his friend, his wife was from Rhode Island. He's writing back to Mr. Bush in Rhode Island, and there was a lot of contact with the Rhode Island people, and they're buying hives, which he has misspelled. This is actually the large is excuse me. This is the largest port in Venezuela they're buying the hides from. And I don't remember what the correct spelling is. It's in my notes down here somewhere. But they're buying hides and they're going to start canning. Canning is an involved process. Besides just being smelly and ugly, it takes a long time. At the time these people are doing it, they just kind of cut the process down to a year, he says, from about a 3-year process, because you get the hides, they come salted from Argentina, Venezuela, Puerto Rico. You have to soak the salt out of them. Then you have to take the flesh off of them. Then you have to dehair them. Then you have to clean up after all of that before you've ever introduced them to the tanning solution. So this whole process of handling the tide, of soaking and tanning, takes about 2 to 3 years to actually process a hide. I'm amazed that people were able to make money at this and had the patience to do it. But now we're involved in global trade. And you can see all the places that the hide market in New York, the leather market in New York is imported hides from Argentina, Buenos Aires, Brazil. Here we are, Morris is a hub of world trade. And this is all being done by wagons. This is all being done by sledges and wagons that we are carting stuff back and forth to the river to take down to the leather market in New York. Shortly before it closed in New Orleans, this is a Sanborn map of the mill that Matson had an interest in New Berlin. This sits right off the main street, right in the corner. Again, imagine the smell in downtown New Berlin. It's fairly enormous mill processing, supposed to be able to process 6,000 sides a year. A side is half a pound. So that's a lot of leather to make. And it was quite a large establishment. Home of another new sawmill down on Bailey Road. Actually, another modern sawmill. Jobs, jobs, jobs. If you're in the economic development field, that's what you talk about. When you attract a new business to an area, everybody wants to know how many jobs is it going to be. Beyond the buildings, beyond the investment, beyond the real estate, beyond the wealth generated, we always measure development in terms of jobs. So here is a close-up of the BWNC. And I come up with 70 people and a dog. I find that amazing in a town, in a village of 600 or 700 people, that almost a tenth of them are working at one organization. Millwrights designed and constructed the mills. There were millstone sharpeners who traveled from grist mill to grist mill, repairing and sharpening the stones because they had to be kept in order to grind the mill to work properly. Wheelwrights worked in the mill to maintain the mill because the cogs wore out, the shafts broke, the wheels would last maybe 20 years. So you were constantly repairing all this wooden equipment as it wore out. You had sack boys to carry the mill up to the top of the mill, and hopper boys to tend the mill, to tend the meal as it was ground, and they were apprenticed to learn the milling trade. Peelers cut the hemlock trees and peeled the bark off and moved it to the tanneries. Blacksmiths were needed to shod the horses and develop machine shops at the same time to keep the mills supplied with basic hardware. Wagon makers thrived. There was a wagon shop listed in almost every town from Burlington Green to Mount Upton. Technology is starting to change. By the 1850s, we're seeing steam engines are showing up, and we're seeing steam powered sawmills, the steam cabinet shop. In Gilbertsville, we're not just simply sawing lumber. Now we're making sashes and blinds, and shingles and lath. Houses are getting nicer. They're getting more refined. In Maple Grove, there's a horse rake factory. In Garrettsville, there's a Ford factory. There had been a hammer mill, but it appeared that the hammer mill was, or the hammer manufacturer was a con job, and he defaulted on his loans and disappeared. He was a very successful hammer maker for a few years with other people's money. Things are looking up. Things are really going well. This is an advertisement for the owner of what before he sold it to Barton. He sells it to Barton in 1852. So he's a dealer in water-powered machinery, and he has his mill on Route 12 for sale in Noblesville. Burlington Green was a much more exciting place than it is now. Even 100 years ago, it was considered much more exciting. And then, in the midst of all of this, a 1,000 men march off the war out of the valley. Only 2/3 come back. At the end of the war, we're able to focus on something different. And a new prosperity returns to the valley. We see some old names like Lowell. And we see some new names like Haber. These are the Hargrave mills at the end of the lake. The mills are being put back in order, and we're getting back to business as usual. We see new names, Leonard's, come in and start to buy up everything in sight. They buy the Butternut's mill, they buy out the Lowell mills, where the Hargrave mill had burnt down, where the Hargrave cotton mill had burnt down, they erect a new sawmill and are heavily promoting it. In Elm Grove, Benjamin has built a very successful chair company. I imagine this was a spectacular dam across the river, or across the creek at the time. We're outfitting the old chair factory on Porter Street and putting a new wheel in there. Morris became famous for its woodenware. There's kind of an evolution of Lowell being forced out by the Leonards as they take over his business. They leave him in charge of doing it because he apparently knew it. We think of ourselves as Dairyland, but actually the money's in sheep. The money's in the sheep farm for sale just up the road too. Burlington, 1875, 2,300 sheep sheared. Butternuts, close to 1,900 sheep sheared. New Lisbon, 2,411 sheep sheared. Far, 1611. Close to 30,000 pounds of wool in 1 year. So the money's in wool, I guess. I don't know, but the 1860, between my own chasing down the different mills and the 1868 atlas, I put together a quick census of mill buildings. There's Burlington and Pittsfield, just to give an idea of the how many we have. New Lisbon is very busy with 3 separate milling centers between Garrettsville, Stetsonville, and Noblesville. Not to be Morris-centric, but
What year was this, did you say?
1868. Now, some of these are historic
Right.
predecessor. The Benjamin factory was built on top of the Lowell factory. This furnace didn't last very long and was gone. This building, this outfit was, the bones were gone. But most of these are listed in the atlas. You can track them down. And many of these we were able to match up with what we saw in the creek assessments we walked. We were able to say, okay, yes, that's this dam, or yes, that's this pond. So I said, many of the mills, some listed as sawmills, some are listed as turning mills. Mr. Ripley invented a saw that he went to the Diston Company, who make machine parts and saws, and says, I want you to make this saw. And they wouldn't put their name on it because they didn't think it was going to work. And he says, trust me. And it ground out bowls and it ground out ladles. And Ripley ladles were famous worldwide. The shop was over on Grove Street behind Merritt Madsen's house. And there's actually a Ripley Street down behind the firehouse now. But there were many chair mills, bowl factories, and turning mills to make handles, spindles, and the like. And I read this not to mention the last mill that was put in to operate in 1918 in conjunction with the Lynn Tractor Factory, and stayed in operation with Raymond, even, I understand, and was probably the greatest crime of this century when the wheel was cut up and scrapped. Well, everything was still intact. But this was the wheel down at Hargrave Lake, one of the largest water wheels on the East Coast in the 20th century. You can see a wheel like this in operation over at Hanford Mills. That's what they use as a Fritz Overshot. It's a 30 horsepower. It's not quite as big. I like their name. What happened? Where did they go? Where did our mills get to? Mills grind things up. They make dust. Dust is very flammable. And we're not using real candles. We're using kerosene lanterns, and we burn our mills down. We burn our mills down with regularity, but not up in Rockwell Mills, the nice restaurant that we all like to go to, burned down 3 times, but they kept at it. And you can see on our county map over there, I've marked a lot of where the fire sites were, and where a lot of the fire damage was. Transportation changed. the railroads arrived. The Albany and Susquehanna was completed to Bingham, from Albany to Binghamton in 1869. The Oswego and Midland reached Norwich in 1868, and it reached into New Berlin by 1870. Campaign as he wanted, as some did in Mars, the railroads never reached up into our valley. And so we became at a disadvantage transportation wise because we were still depending on horse and oxen into the 1900s. The textile mills could not compete with the New England mills in terms of scale. As big as our mill was, the Cohoes mill and on the Mohawk and the mill complex in Lowell were huge, and we simply couldn't compete on economies of scale. The Panic of 1873 triggered a depression that lasted for 5 years, wiped out the lenders' financing, and having bought up everything in sight, their little empire collapsed. They also had some family issues that didn't help. And basically by 1880, they disappeared. The Morris fire was devastating to Morris's economy. And when downtown Morris essentially burnt down, and they were overtaken by technology, by diesel engines and gasoline engines and steam engines, and nobody wanted to fuss with maintaining dams and fuss with milling. They lingered on until into the 30s in many instances. A number of them managed to linger on and stay, but they couldn't compete with the Minnesota grinding mills. The tanning changed its nature in the 1880s. We moved away from vegetable tanning with oak bark and hemlock bark to tanning with mineral salts, and the enormous stockyards that arisen in Chicago. And so the tanning industry moved to the Midwest, and the tanneries closed up by 1900. And most of the hemlock was exhausted by that as well. That includes a picture of clear cutting Morris, but in 1904, there are no trees in Morris. They're gone. It's bare. We would not recognize it, except for I can see Bob's house and my house and the church spires. What we found were ruins. As we walked the creek, we would find obvious man-made structures where the rock had been laid and where dams still existed. This is Zenos's mill on Caden Creek, just below Maple Grove. We discovered quite fascinating that that much of the structure was left. This is up on Caden Creek around Jones Road. This was the end of a dam that had been washed out. There's an amazing mill structure above Jones Road, but much of the foundation is still intact. And I did not get to go up and photograph it in time. I apologize. This was another Caden Creek mill. that we aren't quite sure how they actually got to. We haven't found a road to it as to why would you locate, it was a great mill site, but how did you get to it and from it? But you were using horses, not cars, so it was different. Sadly, we have almost no examples of our mills left in the Butternuts. This is at the intersection in Garrettsville was the grits mill. And this is right here across from Andrea's house, and that was a furniture factory. That was on the Silver Creek. And that concludes our talk. Thank you all. And thank the Morris Historical Society, the Morris Fire Department, my partner Maggie, who has helped me through put all this together and getting Tom through putting this presentation on. So if there's any questions, we'd be happy to entertain.
Tom,
Yes.
the question is, was cider preserved by making it hard cider fermenting it?
Yes, it was not regulated. That was the best way, as we found, to make it keep. If you don't have freezers, it will turn to vinegar.
Which is also good for cooking.
Which is good for cooking, but the best way to preserve the crop. George Washington fought a war over this because the best way to ship corn was to turn it into whiskey. And so we had to fight the whiskey rebellion in Western Maryland and West Virginia over taxing whiskey, but it was the simplest way to get your money out of corn. And so Applejack or hard cider was the best way to preserve the apple crop.
Tom, Jacob Morris mentioned two Butternut Creeks, or the Butternut Creeks plural. Was there something else called Butternut Creek at that time?
No, I think what he's talking about is he had loaded up all his supplies to come up the Hudson River. And the bargeman had taken him up the Mohawk to what they called the landing place, which was somewhere near Fort Plain or Canajoharie. And then he had to transport everything to Hyde Hall and put it on boats. They then traveled down the Susquehanna to Sydney and back up to Unadilla and up the Butternut Creek until he got to the two creeks he's talking about is Morris Creek. That's the second creek. When he says it's the most pleasant of two creeks, was the confluence of the Morris Creek and the Butternut Creek.
Oh,
Is what he's talking about. Pascal Franchot apparently had brought a lot of money with him from France. And the Lulls talk about their initial journey to Morris and getting lost in the trackless wilderness of the woods between Cherry Valley and here. 15 years later, Pascal attempts the same trip and gets lost and says he was lucky to turn up at Schuyler Lake and then gets set on the right track on the Butternut Trail and was sent down here. His father follows, and immediately they hire people and cut a real road. That's the first thing they did because apparently everybody got lost trying to travel from Cooperstown to Butternuts.
We have another question here. I'm curious how many old, it says wells, but I think they might be mills. How many old mills did we come across in our field research? A lot.
A lot. Practically everything on that census of 1868 we could identify.
Oh, she actually meant wells.
Wells,
Yep.
not many, because wells wouldn't be in the creek. We did find a unique structure at the cider mill in Noblesville, outside of Noblesville. We found a unique cutting into the slate of an area 30 inches wide and probably 4 feet deep and 30 inches deep, that we have no idea what it was for. There is this started out to be a comprehensive review of milling. We will probably turn it into 3 more presentations, because the subject is, if people are interested, the mechanics of milling are fascinating, and I haven't talked about the processes and the way the mills were constructed at all. That will be the next
Sequel.
sequel, will be on the technologies they enter to the mills and how the mills work. The third will probably be simply on the textile mills themselves, the deeper exploration of the woolen and cotton industry, and fourth would be the tanning. But as I explored these, they just got deeper and deeper and deeper.
Were the cotton and woolen mills the ones that were the largest with the most employees and
Yes,
and
by
they had
far.
their own villages with schools and
By far. In reading about grist mills, you might have 3 or 4 people. Grist milling was a funny business. It goes back to antiquity. There is a great deal of lore about milling. Millers, the name miller, specifically referred to people who ground grain. Tanners were tanners. Fullers, walkers, tuckers were people who cleaned wool. Sawyers obviously cut lumber. Weavers, spinner, weaver, card, all came from the textile industry. Millers, the way pre-revolutionary war, most mills were what we call custom mills. And you came up with your sack of grain or your wagon load of grain, and you delivered it to the miller. The miller said, "Thank you very much, now go away. Here's a fishing pole, go up in the mill pond." And they were very secret. And they took a toll out of the total weight of grain that you delivered. They took a 16. And of course, some spilled on the floor and some fell through the floorboards. And so there was this whole myth about the honesty of millers, et cetera, et cetera. But they were very secretive and they didn't share much. And the millwright didn't want the miller to know how to fix his mills. So the millwright kept his information to himself. And even the apprentices were partitioned off as to what a particular apprentice might learn, because the miller did not want his secrets getting out, and the miller wanted to stay in business and didn't want competition. They also, if his mill broke down, the millers themselves cooperated, and if his mill broke down, somebody else's mill would do work for him, because they knew when returned, when their mill was shut down for repairs, they could bring their mill back. About the time of the revolution, milling starts to change, and we have what's developed called merchant milling. And we develop a real science about creating mills. Whole treatise was written in 1775 about how to build merchant mills. And these are mills on the that are originally built on the fall line on the coast in Delaware and Tidewater, Virginia. Virginia is the breadbasket of the South. Pennsylvania is the breadbasket of the North. They bring their grain down to the fall line in Wilmington, Delaware, or Tidewater, Virginia. And there's mills, there's tidal mills, windmills, and fall mills that all grind the grain, and they start exporting it to the Caribbean, and they start exporting the business global trade because they're on the seacoast. A tanner might have 5 or 6 people working for him. Again, because it's a very long, drawn-out process. We'll move the hides from back to back and then working the hides. But you wouldn't have a huge work in these industries. One of the first industries to go is the forge, the local forge and furnace. Because the iron deposits are only so big, the Morris iron deposit's relatively small. There's actually some iron here on the table, some iron ore that I dug up today out of the Butternuts. There's still a deposit down there. But over in Troy, by 1824, this fellow by the name of Burton has invented an automatic horseshoe making machine. And he starts the steel industry in America. And the mines are up in the Adirondacks on Lake Champlain. They bring the iron, they bring the iron ore down, and it's smelted and turned into iron. And the first converter, the first steel converter, is in Troy, South Troy, and the Burton Iron Works. And he builds a fantastic water wheel. It's like 80 feet tall that powers his works there. And so, again, economies of scale. You can't compete with a little puddling furnace. A little furnace out in the middle of nowhere. And so the iron industry all simmers into Troy until it's overtaken by the Pittsburgh works.
Where is that big, the Butternuts factory? There were several pictures of it. It was several stories high.
Across the street from Weaver's Market. As you come down East Side Road and where the greenhouses and the hogs are in that area on the east side, that was the mill pond. And the mill was over, he actually was digging up parts of it when he put in his new barn.
The flood recently exposed what I think is part of a tail race. When it washed through there a couple of months ago.
So it's right where the bend in the road is.
Yeah, and that was a stone building.
Yeah, you just like kept going straight instead of taking the bend.
But I just found like small possible structures in the farm that were related to.
He showed my sister the parts before he dug them up or something.
But we've got some gear wheels and stuff that came from there. That's historically. And we think the bell that we have is from the Butternut factory. It was later supposedly moved to the schoolhouse after the factory was no longer used. It was collected from the ruins of the schoolhouse and moved up north and finally came back.
Yeah, the stone, I don't know what happened, where the stone.
I heard that it was used to line the Hargrave pond.
It could have been.
And a bridge down by, is that correct? I heard when they're building bridges down by.
It could have gone into the old road bridge. We were looking at that abutment today, and that's all nicely laid stone. Interestingly enough, the Union Mills in Todsville and the New Hope and the Hope Mill, and I think the Phoenix Mill, were bought up by the Clarks when they went out of business. And the stone from them became Bassett Hospital, the Hall of Fame, and the Farmers Museum. Yeah.
You remember that building you saw in Cahoon Creek, just by Coon Road? It was like 3 or 4 stories high, wooden building with windows along it. Yeah.
That might have been Toll's Grist Mill.
Uh-huh.
That I think is in the area of what was Toll's Grist Mill.
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, most of the tributary mills were on the west side of the valley. The mills, what we found when we surveyed the streams was the east side of the valley streams and the west side of the valley streams were very different. And Stony Creek is this big, long, multi-branched system that reaches into towards Lawrence but there were only 2 or 3 mills on all of Stony Creek. Cahoon only had 2 or 3 mills. Again, Cahoon is this very long system, and it branches into 3 different branches and goes way back up into the hills. Very few mills. And then you have something like Calhoun Creek, 8 mills. Morris Creek, 6 mills. Dunderberg Creek, 4 mills. And you have many more mills on the tributary side of the on the west side of the creek as a whole. So, thank you all again.
We done this today, though?
Yeah,
What area?
across from Lynn Barton's at the Big Bend.
Okay.
There's a small vein. The actual deposit, I think, is down somewhere between Pete Road and Bailey Road. I haven't been down in the creek so far, but it's reportedly a mile and something south of Morris.
Yeah, there's up above Bailey Road, right, canoe up in there, I've seen.
It was intriguing because I had never really heard anything about it. And I'm reading this article about the iron industry in New York State and everything, and they're talking, the big deposit of bog iron ore is in Clinton, New York. And it extends from here up to Oneida Lake, kind of a sliver, but the big bog iron deposits were Clinton, New York. And so I'm reading this article and everything, and it's talking about the bog iron and the Clinton deposits and everything. And then it says, and Morris. I'm going like, I've never heard of any iron deposits in Morris. Apparently it was significant enough that it was noted in like the survey of locations in the state.
Have you been to the, they call it the